Welcome everyone to the Mountain View Library hosting Rick McIntyre, author and wolf expert. Rick is one of the foremost experts on wolves in America. He has studied wolf packs in Denali and Glacier National Parks and has spent the last 24 years as a naturalist and wolf interpreter at Yellowstone National Park. He's the author of The Reign of Wolf 21, the Saga of Yellowstone's legendary Druid pack, and of The Rise of Wolf 8, Witnessing the Triumph of Yellowstone's Underdog. We are joined and moderated today by Jane Billinghurst. Jane has been editing natural history books for nearly 40 years, almost as long as Rick has been watching wolves. In fact, she first worked with Rick 25 years ago on his book, War Against the Wolf. She's thrilled to be teamed up with him once again to edit his series of books on Yellowstone wolves. When Jane is not working with Rick, she's translating books from German, including The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wohlleben. She's lived in the British countryside and in the Canadian prairies, and currently calls the Pacific Northwest home. Jane, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, so we've got a few people in the chat, Candace, who are saying that their screen is black.
Okay.
So,
is it back to normal now?
Is it back to normal now? Well, someone will have to let us know if it's back to normal. Yes, all fine. Maybe it happened when you did yours.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm thrilled to be here with Rick. It's great working with him on all of his wolf books. And I thought maybe he could start out by telling us how he ended up in Yellowstone in the first place. My understanding is, Rick, that you went there in 1994 and you were the park's first official wolf interpreter. And I believe this was actually even before the wolves came to the park. Is that right?
Yes. To review a little bit of history, wolves were a native animal in Yellowstone for 15,000 years. Yellowstone was the first national park in the world. It was set aside in 1872. But even for the Yellowstone Rangers, they felt that wolves should be exterminated. So the last of the wolves were killed off in 1926. It took many decades, but the National Park Service eventually realized that that had been a huge mistake. They never should have done that. So in the early 1990s, they began the process of trying to figure out if it was feasible to restore wolves, to reintroduce them. They got permission to do that, and I started the year before the reintroduction. I had previously worked in Denali National Park and Glacier National Park, two other parks that did have healthy wolf populations. So when I arrived, I was the only employee that actually had been around wolves in the wild. And then they hired Mike Phillips and Doug Smith, two wolf biologists. They started a little bit after me, and they organized all the details of the reintroduction. My job was essentially the public relations. So I was in the naturalist division. Those are the park rangers that do the campfire talks, the slideshows, nature walks, and things like that. So all of my programs in 1994, the year before the reintroduction, were on the upcoming program. And there was a tremendous enthusiasm by our visitors for that. So everyone was totally for it. And then back then I was only working in the summers. I had a job in the desert in the wintertime at Big Bend National Park. So when I came back in the spring of 1995, that was just a few weeks after the original batch of 14 wolves had been released. They were caught in Alberta, 3 different families. And we all thought that because the wolves had been captured in a place where there was very, very heavy human trapping and hunting of wolves, that they would have good reason to not want to be anywhere near the public or the roads or anywhere where they could be seen by people. So my wish for that summer, my goal was to try to see one wolf. And I thought, gee, if I could see one, even part of one wolf, that would be a big success. But on my first full day in the park, I saw an entire pack, the Crystal Creek pack. And so it turned out that the wolves, when they arrived, somehow understood that Yellowstone was a different place for them. It was safe, and we began to see them all the time. So my job kind of switched then from being an educator about the facts of the reintroduction to being an educator about the wolves they were actually seeing. And one of those wolves was the main character in my first book, Wolf Number 8.
Yeah, so maybe you could talk a little bit about Wolf 8. So my understanding is that this is a wolf that kind of surprised everybody with how his life went, and maybe you could say why it was surprising and what happened to him.
Sure. 8 was born in an unfortunate situation for several reasons. He was the runt of his litter, and he looked very different from his brothers. He had 3 litter mates, all brothers. They were jet black. They had beautiful glossy black coats, but his coat was this dull gray. And to make it worse, he was undersized. He was the runt of the litter, and he actually looked a lot like a coyote. And if you're a wolf, you don't want to look like a coyote because they don't like coyotes. His father was jet black, like his mother, like his brothers, and his mother was kind of a whitish color. So he was kind of the odd one in the family. And the people that were involved in feeding and overseeing the wolves in the pen told me that he was picked on and bullied by his bigger brothers when he was in the pen. So he would be like a kid in the neighborhood, a kid in the school that was the smallest one. He looked different from everyone else and was kind of having a hard time. But after they were released that spring, his life really improved because his brothers had all sorts of other things to do. They could chase elk, they could chase coyotes, and so they didn't spend as much time beating up their little brother.
Yes. So they started off, they were in a pen so that they would get used to Yellowstone. They weren't released directly into the park. They spent some time acclimatizing in the park. Well, what happened to Wolf 8 when he got out of the pen then?
Well, the big event for me was something that was startling. It was almost something like out of a Marvel superhero movie. One day he was with 2 of his brothers, and they suddenly charged into a small forest. I didn't know why they were doing that. But as I tried to figure out what was happening, I could see animals running back and forth among the trees. And then a few moments later, one of his brothers ran out and he had an elk calf in his mouth. Then the second black brother ran out, and last as always was number 8. So I was pretty impressed that these very young wolves, very inexperienced, had successfully made what amounted to perhaps their first kill ever in their life. But it turned out that wasn't the story because another animal ran out behind them, and that was a grizzly bear. So it was the grizzly that had killed the elk calf, and the brothers had stolen it from him. Now the problem was 8 was always the last in line and the slowest of the brothers. So the grizzly bear was gaining on him, was catching up, was getting closer and closer. And it looked like this was going to be it because the grizzly bear was maybe 350 pounds. 8 was maybe 80, 85 pounds at that point in his life. And the bear was just about to get him where 8 stopped. He turned around and he stood up to the grizzly bear against all expectations. And that startled the bear. He didn't understand, well, why was this little guy doing this? So the bear hesitated. He hesitated long enough so that the wolf with the calf had gone out of sight. The bear didn't know what to do, didn't know where the calf was, and it just turned around and walked away. But I was the only one that saw that incident, saw 8's heroism in standing up to the bear. When he later rejoined his 2 brothers, they wouldn't share the calf with him, even though he was the big hero that day. So for me, that was the turning point in understanding that there was really something special about this wolf, that he had the makings of a real hero in life. That was my real introduction to what 8 was all about when he stood up to that bear.
There was another wolf who seems to have recognized these qualities in Wolf 8, isn't that right? With something that happens in the next stage of his life.
Yes, it's a bit of a long story, but let me simplify it and condense it. One of the other packs that was brought down was known as the Rose Creek Pack. After they were released, the mother wolf was getting ready to have her pups, and her mate was illegally shot and killed outside the park. That she was known as Wolf Number 9. She had a litter of 8 pups. She was a single mother, and very little chance that her pups were going to survive. So the Park Service decided to mount a rescue attempt. They caught the mother and all the pups. They put them in an acclimation pen, the same one where the parents had been. And the plan was to leave them there for 6 months. So when they were scheduled to be released that fall, with the pups being older, there was at least a chance that the mother could keep them alive. The basic problem was still there, a single mother with 8 very hungry young sons and daughters. And that's where 8 comes back into the picture. At that time, he was a year and a half old, a yearling, equivalent to a teenage boy, maybe at 16 or 17. And we think what happened was he had heard those wolves howling up that ravine. He was curious, he walked up there. And as best as I can figure, when he came into the meadow where some of the pups were already out, he saw something that he'd never seen before in his life. He saw wolves that were smaller than he was. He was always the smallest wolf every day of his life. So his reaction to this, he ran over and he befriended the pups. He played with them. He was watched by the mother. She was desperate for help. So right away, she went over to him. She made friends with him, and he was in. And he now was the alpha male of a wolf pack. So he had gone from the lowliest member of his pack to the alpha male of this new family. It was just an amazing transition. And from that point on to the end of his life, he proved to be one of the greatest alpha males that we ever had. So that was his transition.
So there was one particular incident in his life when he did what an alpha, he was being an alpha male all the time, but he had a particular scene with a rival pack of wolves where he really showed that despite his small size, he had what it takes to be an alpha and protect his family.
Yes. So if you're an alpha male, you have 2 jobs: to go out and feed your family by hunting and to defend your family. That's defended primarily from rival wolf packs. And we knew that in the second year of the reintroduction, when the Druid Peak Pack was brought down from Canada, their alpha male number 38 had an especially aggressive personality. And he actually killed 8's father. In 8's world, his father was the biggest and the strongest and the toughest wolf that he ever knew. So to think that there was a wolf that was so strong and so aggressive that it could kill his father, it would be unimaginable for 8 to try to understand that. And that was the very wolf that eventually challenged 8. So in the spring of 1996, when 8 was out with some of those pups that he had adopted, we saw that number 38's pack, the Druid pack, was charging down. We saw 8 look up on that ridge. He hesitated for a few moments. He was surrounded by the pups that he was raising. And then to our amazement, he started charging forward. I was with some visitors at the time, and I explained to them that they needed to be prepared what they were about to see. Because if 2 male wolves fight, and there's a really significant difference in their size and their fighting ability, the fight is going to be over in a few seconds with the loser on his back. The way that one wolf kills another is to bite the throat. As far as we knew, 8 had never won a fight in his life. He was still small for an alpha male, but despite that, he was charging uphill for all he was worth. In addition to the other drawbacks that he had in his life, even to get to the fight, to begin the fight, he had to run uphill to engage 38. So we saw them smash into each other like this. They were both gray. We could see 2 wolves rolling around in the ground, but because they were so similar in coloration, we couldn't actually see the details of what one was doing to another. But after, just as I expected, after a few moments, it was over. with one wolf on its back, the other wolf standing over the throat. First, that wolf bit the other guy a few times, and we realized the little guy had won. So somehow 8 had managed to win the fight against the much larger, more experienced, more aggressive male. So that was only part 1 of the amazing section of the story. Part 2 was he stepped away and spared his life. And he chased him out of the territory. He taught the guy a lesson, but he won the fight and got rid of him. Now, one of the pups that he was raising, who actually had already passed his first birthday, was technically now a yearling, was Wolf 21. So an important part of 21's story was he witnessed his adopted father win that fight and witnessed his adopted father spare the life of number 38.
So what I'd like to do is we'll come back to 21's story in just a minute. There are just a couple of questions from people. Maybe we'll step more a little bit into wolf biology. So Peter asks if wolves can get hypothermia, which I thought was interesting in what you were talking about, mange and Yellowstone.
Yes, that's a good question. Thank you for the question. So wolves have very thick fur, especially in the winter. And I've been out in temperatures in minus 54, where I had many, many layers on and I was freezing to death. And I would be watching wolves that would be sleeping in the snow comfortably. I could not do that myself. However, we occasionally have mange that gets into our wildlife population. Mange are mites that causes wolves to repeatedly scratch themselves, and that causes some fur loss. So if a wolf has a bad case of mange in the wintertime, they're losing a lot of their body heat to the atmosphere. And so, yes, it could be that a wolf that's in very poor condition has lost a lot of fur. It could die of hypothermia, yes.
So we have a question from Alexi, and it's about whether you've ever petted or touched a wolf. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you observe them and the times when you do actually get to touch a wolf.
Sure, sure. Yes, I get questions like that a lot. The average distance when I'm watching and studying wolves is maybe a half a mile to a mile. So I'm using a very high-powered spotting scope. We do not want the wolves to get used to people. There's a number of reasons for that. First of all, they're wild animals, and so it's not good for them to get used to people. But more importantly, all the states surrounding Yellowstone, Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, they now all have legal wolf hunting seasons. And the wolves have been back in Yellowstone now for 26 years. And so we have had cases where some of our wolves have innocently, or without realizing what the consequences are, have crossed over the border of the park into areas where it's legal to hunt and trap them. So if a wolf inside Yellowstone grows up getting used to being near to people, and then it leaves the park, if it's a hunting season, if they see someone approaching them, someone pointing a gun at them, they don't necessarily have any understanding that this is a threat. They could just stand there and be a sitting duck for them. So that's why we don't want them to be used to us. So the last thing that I would want to do is to get close to a wolf here. And we do have people on our staff that if a wolf starts to get, we use the word habituated to people, that they would start a program to turn that wolf around. That might include hitting it with rubber bullets, using firecrackers to scare it, things like that. So that's the last thing we want for a wolf to get used to us and comfortable.
So I'm going to ask you one more question about wolves and wolf biology, and then maybe we can get back to 21's story. So Candace asks about the interactions between grizzly bears and wolves, and whether the grizzly bears kill the wolves, or whether most of their interactions are around carcasses and food.
Yes. If you were a wolf, you would not like grizzly bears. And the primary reason is the wolves do the very difficult, exhausting, dangerous work of being professional predators. An average wolf here is about 100 pounds. Their main prey is elk. Elk can go up to 700 pounds. Sometimes wolves will also try to kill a bison. They can be up to 2,000 pounds. So it's a very, very dangerous endeavor to be a wolf that's trying to kill something so big. When they kill an elk or a bison, the reason for that is so their entire family can come over and feed it. But if a grizzly comes along, it's going to attempt to take it over, essentially steal it from a wolf family. And so it's primarily the job of the alpha male to do something about that. But that is a continual problem for wolves. That's just something that they have to deal with all the time to try to stop grizzlies from stealing their food.
So maybe this would be a good point to step away from the questions for a little while. And you can talk a little bit about 21. I think when we left him, he was one of the pups. He was observing Wolf 8. Wolf 8 was not his father, but he was essentially raising Wolf 21. Yes, but Wolf 21 was a different kind of wolf in stature than Wolf 8, because they weren't biologically related, right?
Yes, it's really a fascinating story. 21 was essentially the Superman of wolves. He was big and strong, very powerful. When he was a full-grown alpha male, he never lost a fight in his life. So he was, in many ways, physically the opposite of the wolf that raised him. It's a little bit like the story of Superman being raised by the farmer in Kansas. But 21 grew up thinking of 8 as his father because he didn't know any better. So he was trained by number 8. He served as an apprentice to number 8. Everything he learned about being a male wolf, about being an alpha male, about being a father was from number 8. He was very attached to 8. When 21 was a year and a half old and pretty much full grown, they essentially acted as partners on hunts, with 8 as being the senior partner. 21 always accepted 8 as being superior to him. And so it was a really fascinating relationship to watch. 21 was also very attached to his mother, wolf number 9. And of all the younger adults in the family, he was the one that was most loyal to his mother. He stayed with his parents, number 8 and number 9, longer than most young males would. Stayed for 2.5 years, helped them raise several litters of pups. And that gave him more experience than what might have been average for other male wolves. So in his early years, that was his story.
So someone has asked if you have a picture of 21. So maybe you'd like to talk about a little bit about the picture behind you.
Yeah, so I'll move a little bit right up here. Let's see if I can point. Let's see, wait a second. I'll use this pen right here. So 21 is just above my hat. That's when he was full grown. And if you look at the bottom picture down here, this is when he was 6 months old. So he started to turn gray up here. Won't happen to any of us, but wolves with black fur, it happens to them. When he was full grown, he was probably about 120 pounds altogether.
So I think you need to get shift back in the middle there, Rick, so we can hear you well. Let me see. I do have a few more questions, but I think maybe you could talk a little bit about 21 because he doesn't stay with his family forever, right?
Yes. So when a wolf leaves its family, that's called dispersing. And it tends to be way more of the males than the females. Wolves have a matrilineal society where it tends to be a daughter that inherits the territory, not a son. So the young males, like 21, it's way more likely that they will leave home, which is a risky thing, because as a lone wolf, they have to trespass into territories of rival wolves. What would be on their mind, what would be their objective, is to try to find a mate and then to try to find a territory. 21 was always very lucky in his life. And so not long after he left home, he arrived in the territory of the Druid Peak Pack. That was a very aggressive family. That was the family that Wolf 38 came from, the wolf that had tried to attack number 8. But 21, when he got there into that territory, we don't know if he had an awareness or not, but 38 had just died. He had been illegally shot outside the park. So that wolf family, the Druid Peak Pack, they had a lot of adult females. They had 5 pups, but there was no alpha male. In fact, no adult males in the family. So 21 showed up. He howled. Those females saw him. There was a cinematographer, Bob Landis, on the scene at the time. He actually filmed 21's arrival and the meeting with that family. And those females, as soon as they saw this big, strong male coming into their territory, they were all over him. So they very much welcomed him to the territory. And the problem that he had at that point was one of the females in the Druid pack was number 40. And she had a very aggressive personality. She drove her own mother out of the family, drove one of her 3 sisters out of the family. And 21 unknowingly joined this pack that had a member that was pretty much psychotic in her personality. We can talk more about her later, but that's what 21 was getting into when he joined the family.
So I'm just going to take a few more questions here when we're in the middle of 21's story. So Ellen has asked about wolf names and numbers, like whether you give them, how does that work?
Sure. Any wolf that has a radio collar, we try to radio collar maybe about 25% of the wolves in the park. For scientific reasons, they're designated by a number. So we had wolf number 8, wolf number 21, wolf 40. Most of our wolves are not collared. And so the protocol that we have in our research here is to try to refer to them by a name that relates to their appearance. So about half of our wolves are black, half are gray. All black wolves have some sort of a white blaze in their chest, just like most black dogs do. The blazes are different shapes, different sizes. So there were 2 black wolves that were brothers. One of them had a big blaze. The other guy had a small blaze. So we refer to them as big blaze and small blaze. So some name that relates to their appearance. One of the reasons why we don't give them a human type name like Jane or Billy or something like that is rangers used to do that with grizzly bears and black bears. And when visitors heard rangers heard rangers referring to bears by human names, they mistakenly thought that they were tame and they could feed them, pet them, and things like that. So we learned that that just was not a professional thing to do. So something to do with their physical appearance.
So I think you covered this question, but Daniela was asking about your tracking the wolves with the devices. Now my understanding is there's 2 different kind of collars that you use in Yellowstone, one of which will give you more information than another.
Yes, first of all, so I switched from being a naturalist to working with the Wolf Research Project. And so when I was doing that, I was issued telemetry equipment, which would be a roof antenna, a hand antenna, and then the equipment itself that can receive the signals. So when you get a signal, you get out of your car, use the hand antenna to try to get the direction of the animal. Most wolves are members of packs, so you're looking for a group of wolves. And sometimes they're easy to find, sometimes they're not. They could be in a forest, they could be behind a ridge, but most of the time we could find them. And then my job was to record everything they did, all their behavior. So that would be the hunts, the mating season, if they're having disputes within the pack, if there's fights, who wins, who loses, when the pups are playing, I record all that information, nursing bouts, pretty much everything. So if you think of other wildlife researchers, say Jake Goodell, just watching the chimps and recording everything they did, that was pretty much what I did, but at an average distance of about a mile or so. And then I had a lot of government forms to fill out on the wolf behavior. So that was the least interesting part of my job.
So let's get back to that wolf behavior. So you've got 21, and he's joined the Druid pack. There's 40, who is the alpha female, who is a rather aggressive wolf, and there are other females in the pack there too. So what happens next?
Well, one of the fascinating thing about male wolves, and especially 21, is they seem to have an iron-bound rule to never use force or violence or aggression against a female. They have great respect for female wolves. I think that comes from their experience when they're very young, where they understand that the mother is the true leader of the pack. Her word goes. So it's fine if you work your way up to being the alpha male, but that you're definitely not the top wolf in the family. It's the alpha female. She is the ruler of the family, just like it is in pretty much all human situations too. So that was 21's orientation to life. You never do anything to hurt a female wolf. So he had a personality that caused him to be drawn to 40's sister, her same age sister. That was Wolf 42. They both had easygoing, cooperative personalities, so they were perfect for each other, perfectly matched. Whereas 40 had this violent streak to her, and so they just were not compatible. And 21 was in a very difficult phase of his life because he would see 40 beat up 42 frequently, and he just didn't seem to have an ability to know how to deal with that. Sometimes 42 would run over and get behind 21, like she was almost like trying to hide behind him. And usually that would help the situation. 40 would be a little bit hesitant about that, but in the end, 21 really couldn't figure out what to do to help 42. So it was really up to 42 to come up with a plan. And should we get into that part of the story now?
I think we should, yes. So she's been suffering at the hands of 40. 40 has not been treating her or any of the other female wolves in the pack very well.
Yes. So for many of us, we would regard 21 as our greatest male wolf, and at the same time would regard 42 as our greatest female wolf, that pair. So 42 had a very cooperative personality. She wanted everyone to get along, just like a good human leader would like that in his or her operation. So we began to notice that as time went by, 42 established relationships with the younger adult females in the family where she would do favors for them, she would help them, she was forming alliances. And during that time, the situation got much worse with 40. For 2 springs in a row, it appeared that 40 killed her sister's pups. That's pretty much exactly the worst thing that a wolf can do in a family, is to kill family members. And she killed her sister's pups. We think she did that so that all the food, all the resources would go to her pups. So the 3rd spring, 42, as part of her strategy to keep her pups alive, picked a den site that was 5 miles away from her sister's den. We thought maybe that would work to protect her. And she had some of her allies, some of her young female allies, stationed with her at her den. And then late one day, we saw 40 marching the 5 miles from her den to her sister's den. 42's den was in the trees, so we couldn't exactly see what was going on, but I had a sinking feeling in my stomach that 42 once again was intending to wipe out her sister's pups so that all the food would go to hers. We couldn't see what was happening at dark. We had to go in. The next morning I came out. I got signals from both sisters out there. And then someone ran over to me. They were frantic. They were totally stressed out. And they told me that there's an injured wolf on the side of the road. We ran over there, and it was a wolf that was just drenched in blood. And I thought the worst had happened, that 42 had stood up to her sister. She could not win a fight against the super aggressive 40, and this was it. but it wasn't 42, it was 40. And within a short time, she died of her injuries. When we examined her, we found that her hide was just full of wolf bites, way, way more than just one wolf could have inflicted on her. So our conclusion was this: 40 had gone up there. She probably started to go after one of 42's pups. 40 had to do something this time. She tried to fight with her sister. I think almost for sure she was losing. But then, due to all the wolf bites in 40's body, her allies jumped into the fight. So now it was not just one sister versus the other sister. It was probably 3 females against 40. And that was the thing that saved the pups and saved 42. And then what happened next was even more astounding. 21 was getting frantic because 42's pups, 40's pups were crying to be nursed. He walked the 5 miles to 42's den, brought her to 40's den, hoping that she could do something to save the pups. It was in a forested area, so we couldn't see what was happening. What happened over the next day or so is one by one, 42 carried all of her pups, one by one in her mouth, to the central den. There were 2 other females that had pups. She got them to come over as well. And then it took us about a month or 2 to finally realize and document the end result of all of that. But we discovered that 42 was raising her sister's pups. She could have killed them. She could have terminated that genetic line after all that 40 had done to her over the years, but she did the exact opposite. She had taken mercy on them. So at the end of that denning season, we documented that all those litters combined, due to 42's organizational ability, there were 21 pups. And the survival rate at the end of that year was 20 out of 21, which was way, way, way higher than any of the years that 40 had run the pack. So by every standard, 42 was a far, far, far greater alpha female than her sister ever was.
So my understanding, Rick, is that it's very unusual for a wolf to kill a family member within their own pack.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we can move on to that, to some of the life of the pack when 42 and 21 were in charge, and the relationship that the 2 of them had after they got over this initial difficulty.
Yes, it was a longer deal for us and for them, more for them than us. But after the death of 40, that was in the spring of the year 2000, that was when we entered the golden age, kind of a Camelot type period for the Druid Peak Pack. So life was so much easier for 21 in his role as alpha male. He was so big and strong. For him to go out and hunt and have an all-out battle with a 700-pound elk, that was pretty easy for him to do. If a rival pack invaded the territory, he was the Superman of wolves, so he never lost a fight. By the way, he never killed a defeated opponent. He mimicked what he had learned from number 8, his adopted father. And then he relied on 42 to be the leader of the pack, to organize everything, to make sure the pups were properly cared for, to move the pups when the time was right from one site to another. So she was always the undisputed true leader of the pack. And all he did was to work for her and at her direction. And one of my favorite stories about their relationship and how he was totally okay with it was they were all sleeping one day in the meadow. He woke up and he wanted to go on a hunt to the east. He started to trot that way. He looked back. Everyone was ignoring him. He did that 8 times and no one paid any attention to him. The 9th time, 42 got up and she wanted to go in the exact opposite direction. And immediately everyone followed her, with him last in line. So he knew his place in the family. Once again, she was the true leader of the pack. She was the boss, and he just worked for her. That made his life easy for him.
Do you want to touch just maybe on the ending, what happens at the end of their lives? Because they were the alpha pair for a long time, weren't they?
Yes. So there's so much emotion in these stories. There's so much that we as humans can relate to, because like us, wolves normally live in a family situation with parents and the newborn, teenagers, etc. There's no two species on Earth that have social lives that are so much like us and wolves. That's why the domestic version of the wolf, the dog, fits so well into human family life. They grew old together. They were both jet black when they were born, but like many people, they started to get gray at about the same rate. And they both were at the point in their life where they were approaching their ninth year. And that is very, very old for wolves in the wild. In Yellowstone, even with them being protected inside the park, the average lifespan is only 5 years. So they were getting close to double the average lifespan. And then one day, it was the mating season in early 2004. One more time, 21 and 42 got into a mating tie. It was a very touching moment, meaning that she was getting ready to have one more set of litters. Wolves don't have the equivalent of menopause, so they keep on having pups. So at that age, she was probably the equivalent of a woman in her 70s, but still going to have pups that spring. And that was the last time that they were together. We don't know exactly what happened that night, other than a rival pack came into their territory. We think there was a fight, probably as 21 was fighting the main group of wolves. A contingent of the enemy had cornered 42. 21 apparently wasn't aware of that. And we were able to determine that she died of injuries from the fight. But 21 didn't know that, as far as we can tell. So when I wrote the book about 21, I reviewed what happened day by day after 21 was lost to him. 42 was lost to 21. And it looked like he was conducting a search pattern throughout their territory. Their territory ran along the valley that went roughly east and west. So he would go along the west side of the valley, the north side of the valley, the south side of the valley, and he never quite found the place where she died, where her remains were. And as those several months went by, he seemed to deteriorate even more. He seemed to be losing his passion for life. He stopped doing a lot of things. He even stopped hunting, and he just walked away from his family. At that time, his radio collar was no longer working. The battery was dead. And we thought that maybe that's for the best. Maybe we'll just never know exactly what happened at the end of his life. But it turned out that we were able to find out. It turned out that he had walked away. He went way up into the mountains, and we found him in a meadow where he and 42 had spent many, many times over the years. It was a meadow where they could have looked over their whole territory. It was a meadow where the yearlings and the pups they could bring when the weather was too hot down on the floor of the valley. So it'd be a place like in an extended human family where, let's say, maybe the grandparents have a cabin in the mountains, that they would take the adult children and the grandchildren and sit in the porch and kind of watch the whole extended family. That's where he wanted to be, and that's where we found him.
Okay, well, we'll take a moment there. So I'm going to bring you back to some questions that people have. This one is from, let me see, who was it? Alexi, who was asking if any wolf had ever killed a person in Yellowstone.
No, that's never happened. Wolves, a wild wolf seems to have, they're born with a natural fear or concern about being anywhere near us. I think they see us as superior predators. When we spoke earlier about the issue of wolves being habituated, is that natural fear of people can be turned around if someone was to do something that we would consider pretty much the worst thing you could do, throw food at a wild wolf. That they can get addicted to human food. So no, there's never been an issue in Yellowstone where a wolf has bitten or harmed a person.
So Candace had a question about wolf hunting and why it's
Mm-hmm.
legal outside of the park, and if it has to
Mm-hmm.
do with pressure from ranchers, or why is it that if they step outside of the park, they're not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily going to be safe?
Sure. That's a good question. Thanks for asking that. Wolves were on the endangered species for many years. And the way the Endangered Species Act is region by region throughout the 50 states. If a endangered species animal is on the road to recovery, if their numbers are increasing, then a process begins where they can be removed from the endangered species list. That's normally considered to be a victory. So in the reintroduction program, which actually included not just Yellowstone, but 3 states altogether, Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. And they had a certain recovery goal, a certain number of wolves, certain number of packs, certain number of breeding pairs. Wolves do reproduce fairly quickly if you leave them alone, give them some protection. So after a few years, they reached the recovery level. And what that meant is, except for federal areas like national parks, the wolves were taken off of the endangered species list. That meant that then the local states, they took over the management. And we all understood when that was about to happen that the different states probably would have some sort of illegal wolf hunting season. However, there's certain controls over that. If the population was to go below a certain level, they could go back on the endangered species list. So that's a brief summary of why there can be some level of wolf hunting and trapping after they have been restored to a certain sustainable level.
And my understanding is that it's not indiscriminate. There are certain numbers of wolves. There's a kind of a quota in many of some of the hunting areas around the park.
Yes, it's a very complicated thing to get into. And as we talk, there are some draconian laws that are being proposed in some of the local states that would greatly increase the number of wolves that could be taken. So it gets into a complicated situation. But until recently, there were very low quotas, in some cases, a quota of just one wolf that could be killed along the border of Yellowstone. So there definitely is some concern about new bills in some of the local states that could greatly increase the take. So if our listeners wanted to Google wolf issues in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, there'd be a lot of things that they could find that would bring them up to date on some of the current issues. It's pretty complicated for us to get into now, but I'll just say that there's a lot of concerns about things that may be changing.
So Alexi wanted to know if you had a favorite wolf. Maybe, I don't know if it's one that you've already talked about, or if you'd like to mention any other wolves.
Well, that's a good question. And the 3 main characters that we've talked about today, number 8, number 21, and 42, boy, it's hard to pick one of those wolves. You know, they all were just legendary animals. 8 was the classic runt, the classic underdog that you're rooting for to succeed, and he succeeded spectacularly. 21 being the Superman of wolves, you know, just this legendary animal, yet who had all these challenges and difficulties in his life. And then 42, all the stuff that she had to overcome in her life. So picking one of those 3, certainly 42 is the greatest female wolf that we've had. There's no question about that. And my loyalty to both 8 and 21, I guess I just have to put them together on the same pedestal. I like both of them equally.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left to take us to the hour here. And we have one more question that I haven't asked you yet from the people who are listening, from Daniela, who wants to know if you still work in Yellowstone.
No, I finished up with the Park Service in early 2018, so a little over 3 years ago. And the reason for that is I felt that I needed to start writing my wolf books. I was real excited about the possibility of getting everything down so that people everywhere could read these stories. They would be accessible to everyone. And it's easier to do that if you're not working for the federal government. Technically, you can do it, but it's just easier. Plus, as you know, Jane, as an editor working with me, it's a long, drawn out, lengthy process with many edits. And it was just easier for me to do it that way. And it was a good time for me to finish up. Everything kind of aligned correctly on that.
But you still go out into the park a
Yes.
lot, right?
Yeah, that's a good thing to bring up. So I was out this morning and saw 6 wolves in the Junction Butte pack, went down the road and saw 3 others of the same family. And there's many people in Yellowstone. We all kind of work together to share information and sightings. And the section of the Park Service that I worked with here doing wolf research, it's called the Wolf Project. They have a special study going on this morning. So I check in with the crew, the people that used to do my job. They have the telemetry equipment. And so I was watching the wolves with them as well. And so much of my time out in the park is doing pretty much the same thing that I did for many years with the government, but just kind of doing it on my own and still helping people see the wolves and still do talks kind of informally out there too.
So I'd like to finish up with just a few comments that people have made in the chat box. So someone is Daniela is thanking you for sharing the beautiful stories. And Ellen is saying we could learn a lot from wolves about loyalty, leadership, mercy, love, and compassion. And let me see, I think it was Alexi also was saying thank you for the beautiful story. So and we got one. Let me just see if there's. We're pretty. Yeah. So thank you. Everyone is saying in the chat. So I think we pretty much covered what we're going to do today.
Thank you so much, Rick and Jane. 2020 was going to be the year that I went to Yellowstone to see some wildlife. And that didn't happen. So perhaps 2021. But thank you so much. That was so interesting. And it just, you know, makes you fall in love even more with wolves.
And I'd just like to say, so Rick has written 2 books. He's written The Rise of Wolf 8, The Reign of Wolf 21, and this fall he has a 3rd one coming out called The Redemption of Wolf 302, who is a very different kind of wolf from the 2 alpha males who preceded him. And Rick and I are currently working on a 4th book, which will be about female wolves in Yellowstone. So there's plenty of stories out there for you to follow up on.
Thank you so much.
As Jane hinted, 302 was his own wolf. He was very different. He was special in that he was very, very good looking. 21's daughters flocked to him when he arrived, but he had no sense of responsibility. And 21 did not like 302, especially when he got his daughters pregnant. But against all odds, as 302 grew to be an older wolf, he lived as long as 21 did. He totally reformed his life and became a wolf very much like 21. So it's a story of redemption. That's why we call it the redemption of Wolf 302.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much for coming. This has been great fun.
It has. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Okay. Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye.